My name is Andrea Stanton, and I am Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies. And on behalf of my department, the Center for Middle East Studies, and also the C Center for International Security and Diplomacy, we are very delighted both to have you all here and also to welcome today's speaker. So our speaker today is Dr. Craig Considine, who comes to us from the Sociology Department at Rice University. He has already noted that Denver is more temperate and less humid than Houston. And also that flying here from Houston was much easier than flying from the East Coast. His work has been varied and he has been prolific. His first book, Islam, Race, and Pluralism in the Pakistani Diaspora, was published with Routledge. His most recent book, which he'll be speaking partly on today, is Muslims in America, Examining the Facts. And he has a new book coming out in 2019, a follow-up book, Islam in America, Exploring the Issues, a reference work that provides an objective synthesis of information regarding the historical and contemporary placement of Islamic concepts and traditions in the United States. We are really delighted to have him with us today. He'll be talking again about his previous book, Muslims in America, Examining the Facts. So please join me in welcoming this afternoon's speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
It's very good to be in Denver. This is my first time here. I've heard awesome things, and so far, so good. So yes, as Andrea, thank you for the very kind introduction. Before I get going, a few thank yous are in order. University of Denver as a whole for hosting me and my partner Miriam, who is in the back. I'd like to thank the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies and the Center for Middle East Studies. I would like to thank the C Center and also the Department of Religious Studies. So it's excellent to be here at a great university, and I'm happy to be talking today, as Andrea had mentioned, about this new book called Muslims in America, Examining the Facts, which was published in late July by ABC Clio, which is a publisher that focuses primarily on academic reference books. So if you haven't picked up the book yet, you can at least view the first 4 chapters on Amazon. And just as a preference, this book is a bit different, I think, in multiple ways from other books, but primarily the main difference is each chapter has a question. And I answer that question not necessarily with theory or complex concepts. What I try to do is I try to answer the question briefly, and then after that I provide the facts. And I try to focus as much on facts as possible. Because as we all know, over the course of the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years, we have been seeing this term facts in our public discourse, but also in the academic realm as well, especially as it pertains to Muslims in America. So what I'm going to do is bring you on a little journey. I have this brilliant device, which I really enjoy. Before I get into how I actually collected the information and the data, I want to say a few words about some of the main aims and the goals of this book project. In addition to this concept of facts being kind of discussed or under threat, I think 2 main concepts are at the heart of this piece of scholarship. The first is this idea of civic nationalism. And I think this term nationalism, a lot of people often view it in a negative term, and I can understand why nationalism can be viewed in such a manner, because sometimes nations whip up fear and alienate certain communities within their nation. But in the context of this country, our country, we have a tradition. It's not a fact, but this is a concept of theory, this idea of being part of a civic nation and what that actually entails, what that means. A civic nation, which I will discuss as I move through this study, it's in opposition to something that we might understand to be like a racial state or an ethnic nation. So this country, ideally, theoretically, is supposed to be different. That your religious background, your race, your ethnicity, your culture does not determine your worth or your sense of belonging in the nation. We are a country of laws, of values, of principles. So I'm passionate about that idea of making this place a more perfect union. This other concept of religious pluralism. We have to distinguish this concept from tolerance. Religious pluralism is not tolerance, and this has been discussed in the literature. If you simply take something like if your parent tolerated you when you were a young kid, like that's okay. Toleration's not bad, but it's also a bit standoffish. There's a little negative connotation with something like tolerance, but pluralism is something different, and I'm not speaking just about religious diversity. That's not necessarily what religious pluralism is. This idea that there are multiple paths towards the Almighty, to our Creator, which I believe there is. But when I refer to religious pluralism, I'm talking about a process that human beings, that Americans can actually engage in. There's a scholar at Harvard University, Diana Eck, and she is one of the pioneers in this field of religious pluralism. And in short, she describes it as the energetic engagement with religious diversity. The energetic engagement with religious diversity. This is an especially important concept in our country today because we have seen a correlation between anti-Muslim views and lack of exposure, lack of friendships with Muslims themselves. So this idea of energizing ourselves, of creating bonds, of visiting places of religious worship that might not be our own. This is what I mean by religious pluralism, and I think both of these concepts are facing a lot of pressure in contemporary America. Other reasons why this book is important is the rhetoric that is being used, especially in the media, as it pertains not simply to Islam, but to Muslims in America. So what I've done here is captured some of these quotes from influential political figures in our country. These quotes, these comments are making wide-ranging speculative claims and arguments that I think a lot of Muslims and their allies have issue with. And I think the challenge here is because they're coming from such influential figures, they have backing to it. People believe in it, that they have substance. So we see top left this idea, I think Islam hates us, that Donald Trump said to Anderson Cooper on CNN. This is a problematic statement, and I think it should be obvious to us all, treating Islam as a monolith, assuming that a religion can even hate people. The second issue is a conspiracy, top right, that Muslims cheered and celebrated on 9/11. There's a whole chapter towards the end of Muslims in America examining the facts where I consider as much evidence as I could find to debunk that myth. So the book does debunk myths and conspiracies, but it also does a little bit more than that as well, providing facts, surveys, and polls that capture the views and the experiences of American Muslims. We have other kind of comments here as well. Peter King, who is right, talking about mosques, he had said this in 2010 when there was a collection of politicians coming forward in Capitol Hill debating the radicalization of mosques. So he's asserting that over 80% of mosques in this country are controlled by radical imams. One interesting thing to kind of ask yourself is, has Peter King ever actually experienced a mosque? Has he been to a variety of mosques? So again, he's suggesting that 80% of mosques in this country are all one and the same. We have someone like Sarah Palin saying Islam put the I in ISIS. Newt Gingrich, bottom left, Sharia is incompatible with Western civilization. Again, kind of making these overarching broad statements that Sharia is one thing, that it could potentially be codified, that Western civilization is one thing, that it hasn't been influenced by Islam at all. And then Donald Trump bottom right, true hatred among Muslims is too great. So these were the statements, the accusations, the narratives that I found to be problematic. And what I tried to do in this book is to take these accusations head on and to present the reader with facts, with primary documents, with polls to debunk it. So that's at the heart of this book. Like in terms of the data, I'm focusing primarily on treaties and government documents, historical records, buildings and physical structures, presidential papers and diaries, paintings and drawings, speeches, tombstones, databases, voting records, polls, surveys, and press releases. So trying to present the reader with as an objective argument as possible to debunk some of these issues. So just to go around some of these pictures here, we have. So how can I do this? The bottom left, that man there, the picture to the right is actually a picture from the 1918s in Brooklyn, New York, of Polish Tatar Muslims. So this idea of a lot of people they struggle to wrap their head around this idea of Polish Muslims actually being here during World War I. But we have pictures and historical records to actually show that this is indeed a fact. We have President Eisenhower on the top row there. This is in 1956, I believe. He went to the main mosque in Washington, D.C., and he gave an excellent speech. And you can look at the transcript of that speech, in which he basically says, you're just as entitled to a place of worship as a Christian might be. We also have a tombstone here on the left of an Albanian Muslim who had passed in 1949, who had settled in a town called Midford, Maine, and they were working in mills. So we have this massive body of evidence, not simply primary documents, but the book relies a lot on polls. So we have Pew Research Center, Southern Poverty Law Center, the Council of American Islamic Relations, the American Civil Liberties Union. All of these organizations carry out scientific research that provides as an objective analysis or snapshot of the American Muslim community as any other organization. So I relied heavily on statistics and polls. So what I want to do now is bring you through some of the chapters that we actually find in the book itself. So the book starts off with a question on who were the first Muslims to arrive on American soil. Now, before the book was actually submitted, I had an entire chapter on the exploration of what we consider today to be North America before Columbus. So there's a body of knowledge that suggests that Muslims may have sailed across the Atlantic as early as the 9th century from Spain, when Muslims ruled Spain. There's other little historical tidbits, and the reason why I didn't include it in the book is because it's a book about facts, and it's really hard to prove the factual validity of these voyages. But we have different hypotheses that rulers from modern-day Timbuktu of the Mali Empire back in the 13th century actually made their way across the Atlantic. There's more validity, I think, in the argument that there were Muslims on board the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. I think that is a pretty safe argument to make, because if you think about it, 1492 wasn't simply when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It's when the fall of the Muslim, what we call Muslim Spain, the Islamic civilization of Spain ended. So we know that there were loads of Muslims in Spain anyways. So that's just a little bit of information to kind of let your brain expand, this idea that, whoa, there were Muslims here potentially before Columbus. But what we do know, I think, and it's safer to say, that Muslims have always called this country their home, and that Muslims were on American soil long before this country ever even existed. So when we see statements, and we see them often in the public, and I know for a fact a lot of Muslims they hear this thing saying, like, go home. But Muslims have always been here. This has always been their home, just as much as any one of us or any other religious community. The scholarship suggests that the first Muslims on American soil were indeed West African slaves of various tribes in modern-day Senegal, Gambia, Sierra Leone. Scholars suggest that between 10 and 30% of all the slaves that were brought across the Atlantic Ocean were Muslims. There's historical evidence that shows that even someone like George Washington on his plantation, Mount Vernon, you can see his tithe tables where he basically records all the people living on his property and their various histories and how they looked and all the different earrings that they used to wear and the names of some of the slaves like Fatima and Little Fatima and Sambo Anderson. There's solid historical evidence that shows that Muslims were probably practicing Islam at the time of the American Revolution. If they weren't, they may have been certainly informed of Islamic traditions of, let's call it, Muslim culture. I'd say the second group of Muslims to kind of settle on this soil were Turks and Eastern Europeans. So there's historical evidence from Jamestown and other cities in Virginia, and it's been documented by a historian called Neil Jordan. And we have documents coming from 1650, which shows that there were Turks named Ahmet and Mahmud living in Virginia, and that's 100 years before the U.S. Revolution even happened, right? So this idea that Muslims are foreign to our country, to our land, is historically inaccurate. This idea that the founding fathers of this country designed a overtly Christian nation for the Christian people, largely for Protestant people, I also think this argument lacks substance. We have historical records, we have primary documents written by some of these founding fathers, some quotes that suggest that they indeed welcomed the migration of Muslims to U.S. soil. So George Washington, 1783, wrote a letter to Irish Catholic migrants living in New York City who were facing persecution for the simple fact that they were not only Catholic, but they were Irish. And at the time, New York City, largely Protestant of various denominations. Washington wrote a letter to this community saying that this country is open to all the oppressed people. Doesn't matter if they're Jews, they're Mohammedans was the term he used, which is an older term that we would understand today to mean Muslim. We also know that George Washington even wrote sympathetic letters to the Jewish community in Rhode Island at the time, a synagogue actually facing a similar bout of persecution. Now, he didn't mention Muslims in this letter, but if he's opening his country up to Jews, and we have physical evidence that he indeed welcomed Muslims to the U.S. soil, we have factual validity. Thomas Jefferson, we know, owned a Quran. The Quran that is now in the Library of Congress, that Keith Ellison, who is a retiring representative in the House, he took his oath on. Now, we know, too, that Jefferson was sympathetic to the migration of Muslims. There's a scholar, Omid Safi, and he wrote a book, it's published by Cambridge University Press, and he says that the Founding Fathers had a very rational understanding of Islam. None of this kind of sensational binary world in which the West and Islam could not synthesize and could not cooperate. They had a more rational understanding of it. Benjamin Franklin, our top left, there's a fantastic quote by Franklin in which he says that even if the Mufti, the main religious Muslim leader of Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, even if the Mufti wanted to come to Philadelphia to preach Islam, he would have a pulpit at his service. So we have these historical records of the Founding Fathers saying that this is not a country designed or implemented for one group of people, that we actually are a nation of many different people. Now, of course, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, as I had mentioned. Now, this is kind of the ultimate conundrum of the Founding Fathers. How could they have this vision, this universalist, egalitarian, democratic vision, yet they still held slaves? And that needs to be reconciled. That needs to be dealt with. I think if I can leave you with a way of thinking about the founding fathers, of course they're not perfect, but I think they imagined Muslims as future citizens of this country. And I think that is worth remembering. Another historical fact, the first country in this country to recognize the independence of the United States is modern-day Morocco. So back in George Washington's darkest days at Valley Forge, when the revolution, when the Continental troops were fleeing from New York City after getting their behind kicked by the Brits, they fled into Pennsylvania, into New Jersey, and the Sultan at the time of the Barbary States, which is located in North Africa, Northwest Africa today, he actually mentioned the United States as a country that was welcomed into the ports of North Africa if they indeed needed supplies, if they needed resources to fight their battle. You'll see here the Treaty of Tripoli was passed by John Adams in 1797, and this is a passage from this. So during the Revolutionary War, Morocco recognized it, but the formal ties were actually established in two treaties. The first one was 1787. It's called the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. The second one is called the Treaty of Tripoli. They have basically the same language, but the two governments wanted to reconfirm the commitment to each other because things got a bit out of control. There was war skirmishes breaking out between U.S. capitalists, and they weren't paying their tributes to the North Africans, and they got upset. But we see here, this is a passage from the actual treaty. As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, it has no enmity against Muslims or their religion of Islam. So think about it. The founding fathers are outlining this decades ago, centuries ago. Also, if you're interested in learning more about George Washington's relationship with the Sultan, Sultan Abdullah, they had a back and forth exchange. Each of these leaders wrote 2 letters to one another, and you can see this in George Washington's official diary collection. And it's a pretty impressive, I think some of the younger members of our audience today, I think they were bromancing essentially. They were really they were bromancing. So we have that as well. And of course, this is one of the first treaties that the United States had made in history. Certainly the first outside of the European context. So let me get to some other facts. So let's leave history aside for a minute. It's quintessential to recognize that U.S. Muslims are among the most educated communities, religious populations in the country. So what I want to do now, like you'll notice I'll be looking down because I have some statistics from polls and surveys that I want to read. I don't know these literally, there's too many numbers, but I'm going to read some findings. So one is from the Pew Research Center, a survey carried out in 2014. U.S. Muslims have about 14 years of total education, making them the 3rd most educated religious group in the country behind Hindus and Jews. So we have a educated population. Again, the population, we were talking about this earlier in the office over there. Scholars suggest that the overall U.S. Muslim population ranges from about 3 million, but as high as 8 million. It's really hard to get concise figures on that because the census does not ask questions about our religious preferences, right? Because that would be a violation, I suppose, of the Constitution. The fastest growing U.S. Muslim subpopulation within that larger population, Hispanic Muslims, which make up about 8% of the overall U.S. Muslim population. There's a community that I'm quite tight with in Houston. It's called Islam in Spanish, and they have a mosque called Centro Islamico, and it's made up of largely 2nd generation, U.S. born, people from ancestry from Guatemala, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela. And it's one of the most open communities that I've seen, definitely in Houston and the larger country. I bring my students there every single semester, so it's an excellent community. Other facts about education, let me not digress. Pew Researcher, again, 2014, approximately 39% of all U.S. Muslims hold a bachelor degree from a four-year college. Another 25% have had some college experience. So we're looking at 65% of the overall population at least having a college degree. Muslims are as likely as the U.S. public to have graduated from college, right? So in this sense, they're like your average American, your average Joe. Most people, about 25 to 28% of Americans will go on to graduate from college. Interestingly, and this is an important point, in contrast to, let's call it the Muslim world, and I put that in quotes just to not generalize too much, but Muslim majority countries around the world are quite different in their levels of educational attainment as U.S. Muslims. And I think this is very, very important because we cannot conflate what happens out there or what the reality is out there in the Muslim world, Muslim majority countries, with what happens here. You know, like that's like saying Christians in this country are responsible for talking about what happens among Christian militias in the Congo. Like these are two totally separate communities. What's unique, I think, about the U.S. Muslim population is you have the representation of the Ummah, the whole Muslim population. You have people of all different backgrounds. You have Indonesians, Saudis, Iraqis, Iranians, white converts, Africans, the whole lot of 1.8 billion people is largely represented here. And that is not the case in a lot of Muslim majority countries around the world where there's more ethnic homogeny, if I could say that. So we're different here. Also, the good education, the higher levels of educational attainment also lead to higher socioeconomic statuses among U.S. Muslims, which is also important to recognize. Muslim women, as you see the sister here, who is looking quite happy because she doesn't have to do college courses anymore. Muslim women are among they're the second most educated religious community in this country, only behind Jews, Jewish women, right? So this is an important kind of fact that can be quantified that busts a stereotype that we often hear in the public, that Muslim women are oppressed, that they can't leave their home, etc., etc. Just to give you a little joke, I have a good friend, Qasim Rashid. You may know Qasim Rashid. He's active on Twitter. He's an Ahmadi Muslim. But he always, on Twitter, when someone says to him, Muslim women are oppressed, he says, why don't you come to my home and tell me if my wife is oppressive? In terms of other things that can be quantified, the overwhelming majority of U.S. Muslims are left-leaning, liberal, progressive, actually increasingly progressive. So, and this is interesting because in 2000, most U.S. Muslims actually voted Republican for George Bush. And scholars suggest that one of the reasons why they voted as such was because of this idea of kind of conservative values, family values, less involvement with the national government and politics and stuff like that. But things changed dramatically with 9/11 and the subsequent anti-Muslim rhetoric that came with it, and also the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan and the drone war. So that's an important kind of fact that we must consider. So 78% in the last election in 2016 voted for Hillary Clinton of all U.S. Muslims. 8% said they voted for Trump, which was higher actually in the previous election. More U.S. Muslims voted for Trump than they did for Romney, which is, we could unpack that forever. The ISPU, which is the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding in Washington, D.C., another great think tank, they said that 15% of Muslims favored a Trump presidency, while a majority of 54% supported Clinton. So another big chunk actually supported Uncle Bernie. What we do see, and I think if you've been following the recent elections, we do see a kind of coming out party with progressive Muslim politicians that are aligning themselves not with the kind of mainstream Democratic Party with like Hillary Clinton, but the progressive wing, right? So we have Ilhan Omar. Ilhan Omar is a refugee from Somalia. She came here from Kenya. She's now living in Minnesota. She is a progressive politician, and she's going to be representing the 5th District of Minnesota in the House, so she's taking Keith Ellison's spot. We have Rashida Tlaib. She's going to be serving alongside Ilhan Omar in the House. She's going to be a representative from Michigan, right? So we have two Muslim women for the first time in U.S. history serving in the highest political body in our land. Ilhan covers, Rashida does not. Not that that really matters. So let me move to something that we can, this is something, it's one of these buzzwords like Sharia, jihad, honor killings. These are the favorite terms, concepts that some sensational figures in our society like to exasperate. So there's something called the Islamophobia industry. This is something that academia and various political organizations and religious communities actually like to use as a actual term. It's a lucrative business made up of pseudo scholars, politicians, bloggers, religious leaders, websites. It's a very lucrative business. And essentially the business that they're engaged in is the spread of kind of malicious content. This one term that is often adopted or misconstrued is Sharia, right? So you often hear, as Newt Gingrich said in that picture that I put up earlier, Sharia is incompatible with Western civilization. The main critique of this kind of argument is that Sharia is not a codified body of laws. If I asked anyone in this room, show me the US Constitution, you could pull it up on Google and we'd be good to go. This is the law of the land. With Sharia, you would have to bring a scholar, an imam, or a judge with the Quran and the Hadith, right? And each scholar or each judge is going to interpret the text in various ways. We have multiple branches of Islamic law within Sharia, right? We have Hanbali, we have Hanafi, and so on and so forth. It goes on down the line. So when someone says Sharia, the first thing, if you're not familiar with this concept, that you must kind of recognize is that it's not a monolith. It's not a monolith. And the US courts have long, since the 70s, have recognized elements of Sharia in their courts. So when we talk about Sharia, it's something as simple as, I think literally, if we were to take a literal Arabic to English translation, it means the way to the watering hole. The way to the watering hole. And that essentially means water is good for all of us. We know that. So in the Islamic tradition context, Sharia is trying to guide people to a proper Islamic way of living. Now, the Sharia could be anything like a divorce contract, right? Like two Muslims come together and they're saying, this is our agreement according to the Quran, and you do it. But Sharia could be as simple as saying salam alaikum or smiling at someone. Sharia is not a codified body of law. If you take away Sharia from someone, you're taking away the existence of what it means to be Muslim. Now, with that said, we have statistics that show, this is from the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, 2016 study, 65% of all US Muslims said that they wouldn't have any type of Islamic law generating any type of US constitutional law, which means that US Muslims overwhelmingly want the Constitution as their overriding political system. That Sharia is something that should not play out in the courts. It's a private thing. Just as people of all different religious walks of life have private kind of relationships with their faith. Now with that fact, that statistic that the ISPU came up with, the general American public, so in 2012, the Public Religion Research Institute found that a number of American Muslims feel that Muslims are working to subvert this country through Sharia. In 2012, 30% of the U.S. public thought that Muslims were trying to subvert the U.S. Constitution with Sharia. And again, it's impossible. You literally can't subvert Sharia if it doesn't exist in the context that they think it is, that it's a codified system of law. Now, the Center for Security Policy, this is a conservative think tank based in Washington, D.C., run by Frank Gaffney. who is well known for making kind of sensational comments. His center put out a survey which asked US Muslims a number of questions. One of the questions had to do with Sharia. The survey had 6,000 Muslims. The website headline of the Center for Security Policy said ominous levels of support for Sharia and Islamic Jihad among US Muslims. So of course, people started freaking out. And it found that 51% of the poll's respondents said that US Muslims should have the choice of Sharia in US courts. So this is what their poll found. Half of Muslims in this country want to go into a court of law and want to have their idea of Sharia supersede the Constitution. From a scientific perspective, if you look at the poll, okay, if you're into like quantitative studies and if you've designed surveys, you'll know that this poll was an opt-in survey, right? Which means that there's very little probability that the survey respondents are representative of the overall US Muslim population. So it's a non-generalizable opt-in survey. Anyone in an academic realm, I think we can agree that that is highly problematic, especially when the headline says 51% of US Muslims believe this. Now, I'm bringing this up because sometimes facts are presented to you as such, and they're accepted by some of the most influential leaders in our country. Donald Trump went to this poll, came out publicly and said, these are the facts, and he used this poll to justify the Muslim ban, the Muslim travel ban, which is now official law passed by the Supreme Court. So we have to be careful with what we recognize as facts. This idea that Muslims commit the most acts of terrorism on US soil has received a lot of attention in the academic scholarship because one of the justifications for the Muslim ban was that refugees and Muslim migrants pose a serious terrorist threat to this country. Just to let you know, of all the countries on the Muslim travel ban list, and this is the first version, the second version, and the third version, no one has ever, from any of those countries, has ever committed an act of terrorism labeled by the US government on US soil ever, according to the scholarship. The only refugee, and not to throw Cubans under the bus, but the only refugee that has ever been convicted of an act of terrorism in this country came from Cuba. So there's a little tidbit of information. There have been tons of studies done by academics at leading institutions around this country that have tried to document violent crimes and acts of terrorism. So I'm just going to label a few. Charles Kurzman of University of North Carolina, prominent sociologist. He carried out a joint study with David Shanzer of Duke, and they found that right-wing extremists averaged 337 attacks from 2001 to 2015. Sorry, that's not an average. 337 attacks from 2001 to 2015, causing a total of 254 casualties. The Global Terrorism Database in 2007 at the University of Maryland College Park found 65 attacks by far right-wing ideologues in that same period, 2001 to 2015. Only 24 attacks by so-called radical Muslims. And it kind of goes on, and I document this in the book. The evidence is showing, and the FBI even reflects these findings. The FBI from 1980 to 2015 came to the conclusion that nearly 94% of all terrorist attacks carried out in this country were by non-Muslims. And the FBI actually found that the largest form of terrorism is actually environmental terrorism. So to the refugees and the immigrants, multiple right-leaning organizations in this country are also pushing back against the Muslim travel ban based on the facts. So we have the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. It's right-leaning. They carried out a study on the first executive order, 13769. Of all the countries, and I mentioned this, of all the countries listed on that first travel ban, 0 attacks were carried out by any national from those countries from 1975 to 2015. So they wrote a report titled Little National Security Benefit to Trump's Executive Order on Immigration. They also carried on their analysis, and they said the annual chance, this is the Cato Institute, the annual chance of being murdered by someone other than a foreign-born terrorist was 253 times greater than the chance of dying in a terrorist attack committed by a foreign-born terrorist. Kind of startling figures. Kenneth Miller, a psychologist who carried out a study on whether refugees are a threat to Americans. You might have seen this little table that he came up with, but he documented all the things that are more dangerous than refugees and immigrants. Secondhand smoke, 41,000 deaths annually. Alcohol-related car crashes, 10,000 deaths. Gunshots, 33,000 deaths annually. Medical errors, 250,000. Bicycle incidents, 800. And perhaps most startlingly, toddlers. 23 people have been shot by toddlers on American soil since the start of 2016. Exactly 23 more than have been shot by Muslim refugees over the same period. So I'm not trying to take a piss here. I'm just trying to look at some statistics, some facts. You know, like we had so much rhetoric boiled up around the travel ban. And it was so in our face that we were almost kind of divorced from reality. Looking at the figures, refugees are fleeing violence. There have been reports by the Obama administration that actually show that the overwhelming majority of refugees are women and children, not men of age that can be so-called combatants or militants. Okay, a few more slides. Do Muslims condemn terrorism? Yes. It's called Google. Hera Hashmi, who's actually a student here in Colorado. Hera Hashmi, so we have a sister here who's familiar with her work. Some student in one of her classes was given her flack because she didn't condemn a terrorist act. So she was like, well, you know what? I'm going to go home, make a Google spreadsheet of all the times in recent memory that U.S. Muslims and Muslims around the world actually condemn terrorism. She came up with 712 cases and put it on a Google spreadsheet. She documented it on this website called Muslims Condemn, and it's an ongoing project. It's continuing to this day. After every single act of violence, unfortunately, Muslims feel like they have to come out and set the record straight. That's got to end at some point. But they consistently have to denounce it, and they do denounce it. A simple Google search, the Council of American Islamic Relations, major advocacy organization. The Islamic Society of North America, major advocacy organization. All the major organizations come out and denounce it. And yet Muslims are still asked to condemn. You even hear this narrative on something like Fox News or InfoWars. On the kind of more conspiratorial side, this is something that I've often heard in talks that I give in churches in Texas. This idea of jihad camps existing in America. And again, that term jihad, there is nothing in the Quran that says jihad means holy war. Jihad can literally be interpreted to mean struggle or to strive. So it's like Sharia in a way. Sharia is the way to the watering hole, to the way of goodness. Jihad is struggling with things in your life. That's not to say that there is not a defensive angle to jihad. There is. But Muhammad said after returning from a battle, the greater jihad, or the lesser jihad, is military combat. The greater jihad is to work on your soul, to perfect yourself, to do things like don't swear, don't be mean, don't give someone the evil eye, be a good friend, submit your paper on time. I mean, jihad could go on and on. But there is this narrative that there's a place called Islamburg in rural Islamburg in rural New York. And it got the attention of right-wing pundits, and they were suggesting that there was a community, and they were literally preparing for armed warfare, guerrilla warfare. Make a long story short, Associated Press, Washington Times, a bunch of major journalistic outfits have gone there and reported on it, and actually interviewed people, you know, like not sit behind a computer screen and read what you see on the internet and say, well, this jihad camp exists. We also have facts. Law enforcement, local officials near Islamburg have told these journalist outlets that they have a working, productive relationship with this community. So This man to the bottom right, Robert Dogart, right, he was radicalized online, and he had this idea that Islamberg actually existed and this idea of a jihad camp existed. And the FBI kind of entrapped him, but they got wind that he was actually engaging in a military excursion on the people of Islamberg. And the FBI was coordinating with him, giving him guns, and eventually the FBI pulled the plug and said, you're about to commit an act of terrorism. But that goes to show like how people can get radicalized on the internet by a sensational story like jihad camps. The other kind of concept that I actually didn't write about in this book, but it's this idea of Muslim no-go zones. Muslim no-go zones in America. So there are parts of urban environments and cities where like only Muslims live and no non-Muslims can enter, because if they do, they're going to be subjected to Sharia. That is a hangover from the European context. There are certain areas of European cities that do have a kind of concentration of Muslim people, and the living conditions in those areas are not great. Like I've been to parts of Bradford that are populated predominantly by young Pakistani families, and it's not a great living condition. I wouldn't say they're necessarily ghettos, but there's real structural issues going on in those communities. And they do have maybe some antipathy to non-Muslims, but we don't see that in the United States. I looked around as much as possible to try to find a Sharia no-go zone, and I could not find it. I don't know if it exists. Last two things. This idea that Muslims are intent on stifling freedom of speech. We saw this play out at the Democratic National Convention when Khizr Khan, who was a Gold Star father, the son of Humayun Khan, who was killed in Iraq, he was up there in front of the convention, and his wife, who was mourning, who had lost her son years ago, was sitting there quietly. The next day, I think most of you know that there was some beef between Donald Trump and the Gold Star family, and Donald Trump said, well, I think one of the reasons why she didn't say anything was because she wasn't allowed to say anything, because she's a Muslim woman, and Islam tells men to oppress their women and to keep their mouth shut. So sending off this idea that Muslims don't believe in free speech. We have statistics that actually show that they do stand for freedom of speech. In 2015, a group of 200 prominent North American Muslims, some of the leading scholars and religious figures on the continent, came together and created a statement which literally notes that North American Muslims unconditionally condemned any intimidation or threats of violence directed at any individual or group, even when that speech may be perceived as hurtful or reprehensible. So I'm not saying that some Muslims that all Muslims are for free speech, but the overwhelming majority are. But we could also ask ourselves, we have non-Muslims, Christians, Jews, who are also saying, well, sometimes freedom of speech is bad. So we kind of have to divorce ourselves from this idea that Muslims are the only religious population actually concerned about something like freedom of speech. The Cato Institute, again, to give you some more facts, they collaborated with YouGov a couple years ago. They had a data set of 2,300 people, and they asked what constituted permissible public statements. And they were looking at things like, should offensive speech be barred? And the poll found that U.S. Muslims were actually less likely to be in favor of banning offensive speech in comparison to African Americans, Jews, and Hispanics. So to give you the numbers, 46% of African Americans, according to this poll, were for banning offensive speech, 41% of Jews, 39% of Hispanics, 37% of Muslims. So that's an interesting little tidbit there. I'm going to skip freedom of religion because we kind of went over that. Last one, this idea that Muslims are disloyal to the United States. This is one of the kind of cruelest accusations, I think, against this population, because one of the ultimate sacrifices that any individual could give for their country is literally to sign up to perform in the armed forces and to give your life. Now, that is not to say that that should be the barometer on which we measure whether Muslims are loyal or not. but we have to recognize the fact that U.S. Muslims have always fought for this country. They've always defended it. Scholars have pulled out some documentation that Muslims even fought in the American Revolutionary War, and that they have actually fought in every single major war that this country has ever fought in, including both sides of the Civil War. So to give you some individuals throughout history, there's a man named Muhammad Ali Ben Said. There's actually a picture of him. He served in the Union Army from 1863 to 1865. Born in Bornu near the modern-day border of Libya, Chad, and Sudan. There's another man, Private Muhammad Khan, a native of Iran, who was also named as John Amahale. So a lot of these soldiers later adopted kind of more Americanized or Christianized names. In World War II, we had an American Lebanese professor and scholar named Philip K. Hittai, and he was working at Princeton and Harvard, and he published a report in 1924 that found almost 14,000 Arabs serving in World War for the U.S. in World War I, and he claims that about 5,000 of that 15,000 were Muslims. So 5,000 Muslims fighting for our country in World War I. Now this is important too, because most Arabs in this country are not Muslim, they're Christian, and that can be statistically proven as well. World War II, approximately 2,000 men with Muslim-sounding names served throughout the various campaigns. There was one man named Abdallah Igram from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. When he was serving, Andrea, you've heard the story about the dog tags. So at the time in World War II, there was no M for a dog tag. There was a J for Jews, there was a C for Catholics, and a P for Protestants. So when he left the military, he petitioned President Eisenhower twice. It took him about 2 to 3 years to get it across. But finally, Eisenhower says, thumbs up for the M to recognize it. Korea and Vietnam, Muslims also served. Today, approximately 6,000 people who identify as Muslims serve in the armed forces. Now that's less than 1%, which raises a lot of challenges. Oftentimes, one Muslim individual in a particular unit or platoon is often like the face of Islam, which raises challenges. This is Humayun Khan. This is the son of Khizr Khan. And this is in Arlington National Cemetery in DC. So the last point here, there's never been America without Muslims. I think we've established that. They've always defended the United States. U.S. Muslims are highly integrated and similar to what we might consider to be mainstream Americans in terms of their political participation, their levels of educational attainment. I didn't even get into their political advocacy, their civil rights work, their interfaith efforts of trying to bridge gaps between different communities. The main challenges that we face are that anti-Muslim realms, the Islamophobia industry, they misrepresent the reality of what is actually happening in real life on the ground. And challenging these kind of false narratives is a real challenge for our society if we want to create this more perfect civic national union, and if we really do want to embrace not simply religious tolerance, but pluralism and the energetic engagement with diversity.
Thank you very much. We have time for some Q&A, and we have conveniently stored the second microphone right up here, right next to the first one. So I think Zaid will kindly walk around, just for the benefit of everyone being able to hear, and also for the purposes of the filmers being able to hear the questions. Please wait for the microphone to come to you, and then enjoy your moment of fame or the voice impersonation by speaking into the microphone, and then Craig would love to take your questions and comments.
Can you hear me? All right. First of all, thank you so much for this. This was absolutely very helpful, very eye-opening. I'm also Muslim, and I am dealing with Islamophobia as well. not necessarily in Colorado. I moved to Colorado because of Islamophobia, because Colorado is the most nicest state, I think, in the United States. I've been to many of them. And I think I found it really hard, very difficult to express myself. When people say or ask what my religion is or where I'm from and things like that, what would you recommend? Like, I'm definitely going to buy your book to really learn the facts and tell them, okay, this is what is happening, and please read the book instead of going to internet and finding false information. But I'm really curious, how would you approach someone who is so judgmental and who just brings you information that is not true? Uh, what do you do? How do you really keep your calm and and answer them in a way that maybe hopefully they will go and look at different sources and find true information?
I think each case needs to be dealt with. Like each person that holds these views needs to be dealt with as an individual. Because is this thing on?
Yeah.
Okay, it is on. Sorry. I'll give you an example. Like a student asked me or raised this question the other day in class, and basically we came to the understanding that it really matters about what their intention is. So if someone comes to you and says something malicious or something false, but they're not, the statement might be malicious, but you could tell that they're not really being malicious, then you can ask them, I'm willing to sit down with you. If you want to have a conversation about this, I can tell you about my perspective. I think that is a good start of gauging people's intentions. Because a lot of people, to be honest, when they come with these ideas, for instance, the ISNA convention, the Islamic Society of North America convention, was in Houston 2 weekends ago, and we were outside, and there was people about as wide as this room with assault weapons. Okay, like literally assault weapons, and screaming like Sharia, like go home, jihad. For people like that, I'm really not sure you can rationalize with them. Like they might be too far gone. And I'm an optimist. I swear to God, I'm an optimist. But we have to identify those people that could sway either way, right? Like some people might be too far gone. Forget it. But there might be people who have these ideas, they have these views, and you might be able to say they're just misinformed. But maybe they want to learn. Ask them if they want to learn. The best thing to do is break bread with people. Sit down and say, listen, if you want to have lunch, we can talk about this. But it really depends on their intention, And I hate to say give up on people who are just too far gone, but from what I've experienced, oftentimes there's nothing you can do, nothing you can say. They're too far gone. But the people who are swayable, those are the people that would be great for you to reach and to bring into this kind of more democratic court, this more inclusive court.
So Craig, if the facts are so clear, why is the fear so great? In other words, how do you explain that when Donald Trump comes to office, the first thing that he does is he implements this executive order calling for a comprehensive Muslim ban, and 50% of the country, way beyond the core support of the Trump base, votes in favor or, when polled, supports a comprehensive Muslim ban? What's your political interpretation of what's happening at this moment in this country that explains the high level of Islamophobia?
So I'll tackle the political thing first, and then I'm going to get to why the fear exists. In terms of the politics, like what's happening right now is absolutely nothing new. This is something that has happened over and over again in our collective, in our nation's political history, that minorities are being used as scapegoats, as ways of building exclusive narratives in order to acquire and to kind of establish one's political base. So I would need to look at some numbers here, but I'm going to make a broad claim. Most of Donald Trump's supporters have never met a Muslim. I'm going to say that with confidence, that they've never entered a mosque. So if the leader of the party of a certain demographic, of a certain base, is coming out and saying these people are terrible, and the people who are actually voting have absolutely no context of who those people are, what they believe in, then it's easy to brainwash them. And I actually think there is brainwashing going on, and I think there's a lot of propaganda going on. Brings me to my second point, Nader, what you were saying, like, why does the fear exist? Largely because of the media. And I think the main issue with the media is not simply the narratives, it's the representation. That oftentimes Muslims are not being able to represent their faith and their experiences in the media. And I think that's a massive challenge. You know, like, let's bring in, I mean, even me, like, sometimes people invite me to talk about the experiences of Muslims, and it makes me feel uncomfortable because I'm not Muslim, right? Like, I can provide different narratives and I can help build bridges and stuff, but if we're talking about something like hate crimes and people experiencing Islamophobia, Muslims need to be the people talking about it in the media itself. So I really do think, Nader, it's like an Orwellian kind of game where there's like misinformation out there, and political figures and political forces know it. And they know that there are people out there ignorant of it, and they take advantage of it, unfortunately.
Do you find it useful to distinguish between the teachings of Islam and the culture in some Muslim majority cultures in terms of explaining the hatred, or is that just too much effort to convey that distinction?
Oh, it's a really important distinction, and we were talking about this earlier. When we talk about Islam, the teachings of Islam, we have to remember that ideally they are a kind of set of ideals, but that they're going to be interpreted differently by various people, right? Same thing with this idea of like Muslim culture. I think broadly you could talk about a Muslim culture existing, you know, saying salam alaikum and praying a certain way, like broadly, but Islamic practice or Muslim culture is going to be a hell of a lot different in Bosnia than it is from Detroit, than it is from Indonesia. So one thing we see with an appropriation of something like honor killings, right? Like that happened in Afghanistan and Pakistan or wherever. People are saying, well, Islam is actually commanding people to do it. There's absolutely no record of the term honor killings or even anything really close to it in the Quran or the Hadith. It's being carried out by Muslims, but some people are saying it might be a product of more localized cultural developments. And we also have to ask ourselves a question, like, there are non-Muslim honor killings that happen because of culture in this country. But no one is kind of conflating American culture and Christianity as being kind of like a mega beast of creating all of this kind of violence. You know, like there seems to be a double standard. Westboro Baptist. I mean, well, even, you know, that's why I brought up my point earlier about some Christian militias in different parts of the world. Like when they act out, usually it doesn't get media attention, at least mainstream, you know, because it's not news. Christians killing Muslims is not as interesting, I suppose, as the other way around. But nobody asks me or anyone else to condemn what is happening in a country like the Congo. No one's asking me to do that, even though they are blatantly saying we're doing this in the name of their God. And I'm linked to them because I also identify as Christian, but no one's asking me to condemn. But with Muslims, there's a clear double standard.
Thank you, Craig, for a very enlightening
Thank you.
presentation. I'd like to just add a few words. Now speaking as a Muslim Arab American, but also a scholar. I'd just like to add in part answer to the question. Because people, Americans, feel that they have been attacked. We have to acknowledge that. Why is the fear coming from? Because people feel, rightly so, that we've been attacked, and we've got to admit it when we're speaking about Islamophobia. And the second point is we must approach those on that side you were pointing to, not those that side who are amenable to understanding. We have to acknowledge and to approach the issue with some humility and recognize that we Muslims and the Muslim majority countries have failed in many respects have messed up, have screwed up ever since the great Islamic era, before the great European revival. We have declined. And it's our problem how to rise. And so we have to acknowledge that we are not perfect and we come from failed states, most of us.
I wouldn't say most of us. I think it's two ways. Yes, we're not perfect either. None of the religions are perfect. None of us. It's just, you can't just paint the whole group with one brush and say we failed. No, I don't think we failed. Yes, do I condemn all the terrorist attacks? Absolutely, absolutely. I know someone who died in 9/11. Absolutely. It's never right to commit to any crime. It's not related to religion, in my opinion. It is not. And you can't, I found that offensive that you say we failed. No, we didn't fail. Those groups that call themselves radical Islamists, I don't believe they are Muslims, or they think they have different interpretations. I don't know. I don't really care what their religion. But we as people, regardless of our religion, we have the responsibility of thinking, okay, this is not the religion that makes people do that. It's their minds, how they interpret their religion and commit any crime. I hope I'm making sense. I hope I'm not being hurtful to you. I'm just trying to say that it's not Muslims failed. It's just those terrorists happen to be Muslims, but that doesn't make all the Muslims terrorists.
Let me be clear. When I was speaking about failure, I was talking about the failure of Islamic civilization during the rise of European civilization. The fact that the Islamic Golden Age preceded was in the Dark Ages in Europe. I was not referring to Muslims failing because they let these terrorists out through the ranks.
But even then,
That's a different subject.
Yeah.
I did not address that.
but even
But
like,
you are right in every other respect.
I see what you're saying, and I think it has value. But even then, like, if we ask like why Islamic civilization has failed, and if we're talking about having humility, like if we're saying that there's a failure of Islamic civilization, like we as Americans, as Westerners, as Europeans, like also have to be humble and recognize that we may have had a massive role in that decline because of colonization, imperialism. So it goes both ways, I suppose. This guy's got a
This has
question.
been a very interesting exploration of prejudice, and I'm just wondering if you see in your contacts in the Muslim world, in the U.S., a combination of efforts that would lead to a kind of united front to combat some of these myths. I think we all recognize that the Jewish population has a strong voice, united voice on certain issues. And so do you see that developing in the Muslim community at all?
Yes, and I think the Muslim community at large has multiple organizations who are working on kind of amplifying the voices of Muslims in this country, largely through the political realm. So some of these organizations like CARE and ISNA, they're working to elevate. But I think the more important thing to recognize is elevation does not happen in isolation. So we have Jews, Christians, Muslims, people of all walks of life coming together to raise up the voices. So there's something called, talking about initiatives that you kind of wondered about, is there anything happening? Yes. In Omaha, Nebraska, there's something called the Tri-Faith Initiative. There's a campus where there's a synagogue, a church, and a mosque. And they share that space together in a kind of Abrahamic spirit. So I think we do have very real, constructive, tangible projects and movements going on, not simply by Muslims, but of their allies, trying to enhance that voice, to empower that voice. I think our challenge is that we just don't hear about them because they're not news, you know? As they say, if it bleeds, it leads. That's usually what we see on the media is violence. We don't see peace. So that's our challenge, getting those narratives of cooperation and respect and bridge building out there. People need to know that it exists. It enhances our faith. This guy's had his
So
question.
yes, so and I have the unpleasant and not very interesting bureaucratic task of keeping us on time. So we have time for 2 relatively quick questions and answers. And yes, so question number 1 goes to the man in the black shirt.
Good. Well, I don't need a microphone.
We actually do need one for the filming.
Okay, very good. My name is Mark Winfrey. You're under some criticism in our local Muslim community for scheduling the event for Friday prayers. Can you just address that? Any problems you had? Why the scheduling was like that? Was it taken into account, or just a small explanation to the community?
All I can do, my friend, is invite you to Regis University today at 3:30. There's another talk.
Ah, good. Obviously, my presence here indicates that I'm not a strict adherent of that criticism. But
yes, so that is actually one of the ongoing ironies of academic life. And for those of you who would like even more of that, I teach a class called Introduction to Islam, which is in the winter quarter, and it is scheduled for Tuesday, Friday, 12 to 1:50 p.m. Intro to Islam, as we were chatting about earlier, probably isn't one that most self-identified Muslims need. Yeah, it is a real challenge. We had actually hoped to do this in the winter on a different day. We are unfortunately working with a bunch of academic scheduling constraints. So yes, we are sorry, and we certainly take that into account. In this particular case, the combination of multiple university units and space on campus were 2 of the major factors, not any intent for offense. So we do apologize for that and appreciate your tolerance of our poor scheduling constraints on this.
Can I jump in and do a little plug too? So Dr. Considine will be out at Regis University this afternoon, 3:30 to 5 in Claver Hall, room 315. So I'm just going to leave a couple of these flyers up here in case anyone is interested. Dr. Considine will be speaking on the topic Catholics in Dialogue with Islam. Those are just right up here.
Yeah, so it's a bit different from this talk. Like, this is obviously based on the book research, but the talk this afternoon will get into different types of dialogue, you know, not simply interfaith, but what we can do as human beings, as members of communities on an everyday basis. I think we had one more question.
Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. My name is Iman Judah. I'm the spokeswoman for the largest mosque in the Rocky Mountain region.
Thanks.
So I would like to echo his concerns and just say there's 75,000 Muslims in Colorado that were actually really interested. I'm not going to say all of them, but there's 5 Muslims here today. It's, I would say, insensitive. That said, I would also like to say that there are countless organizations in Colorado, over 30 mosques, up and down the Front Range. I'm one of the co-founders of the Colorado Muslim Leadership Council, and when we hear things geared towards comments like, where's the Muslim voice, or where's that unity, or why aren't you condemning, or why aren't you rising up, we are. And it's through organizations like that, and more so, you're right, I think it is a lack of media attention, and we are combating that. But one thing that you didn't mention that I think is important to consider, and something that I lecture about here at the University of Denver, is that I think a huge misconception is that the Christian and Jewish populations in the United States have been here far longer than Muslims. And their establishment here has allowed them the credibility to have that establishment, whether it's in Hollywood, in Washington, in legal areas. And a majority of Muslims here are now the sons of immigrants and refugees. And it's only my generation and my sisters here that I'm seeing that are just now becoming educated in the United States and taking the positions of military, like you said, or getting elected to office. So this is, I think, a new phenomenon for Muslims, and we're just now catching up. And if we just catch up to our brothers and sisters in the Judeo-Christian religions, then you're going to have to allow us time for growing pains.
Yeah, I would just say as well, like one of the most organized Muslim communities in the history of this country has been the Nation of Islam, which has existed since like about the 1930s. But yeah, I do think some of the more recent immigrant communities coming out of like 1965, when the Immigration and Nationality Act passed, this is like post-civil rights movement, that's when the U.S. Muslim population went from like 200,000 to 1 million in like 10 years. And it was for the first time the U.S. really opened its doors, at least for legal immigration from the Middle East and South Asia. So we do see some of these communities now, established and powerful and making their inroads, as every community has done in previous generations and centuries. It's part of the American process, I suppose.
All right, well, thank you very much for joining us, and please join me one more time in thanking our speaker today for his talk.